Ormsbee from Florida State University is North America's authority in nighttime nutrition. So he's going to give you an overview of what happens at night with protein ingestion, and then looking at specific things that everybody wants to know about. Mike Ormsbee from Florida State.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Rob, Dymatize, Kim, for bringing us all in. Thanks for all that. This topic's really fun for me to talk about. I get to speak about this a number of different occasions every year, and it seems to keep growing. So he's said in North America, but there's many other researchers who are working on this prominently from the Netherlands right now, and Luc van Loon's group. So I'll talk about some of what we're doing and some of what they're doing, and kind of make the story come together. We have worked with nighttime feeding since about 2010, and we worked in different groups from the obese all the way through pretty elite athletes at Florida State. So we have a wide gamut of interest there, and our lab is primarily focused on things like metabolism and lipolysis, whereas Luc's lab is more focused on MPS, muscle protein synthesis, and hypertrophy. So combining all that is a very neat way to get the full picture. This summer at ACSM, actually, Luc and I are giving another tutorial on this. If anyone ends up being there, you'll have both sides of the story from us. So the story began for me in a way that was really practical. I was an athlete in college playing ice hockey, and I ate late at night. All of my teammates ate at night. We trained a lot, double sessions, resistance training, etc. And eating at night wasn't a problem, but then you started seeing media figureheads sort of pick up on don't eat after 7 p.m. You've probably heard of cutoff times to stop eating, and that sparked our interest. And then the leanest people I knew, the bodybuilding group, they always ate at night before going to sleep, and it was typically protein-dominant foods, eggs, cottage cheese, or most of the time it was a powdered shake. And so looking at that data, it just always seemed weird to me that the leanest people I ever saw ate late at night and had no problem, but the other groups seemed to have a problem where the media was telling us that we had some issues with eating late at night, right before sleep. And we define that as 30 minutes before bed, and I'll sort of get into that here. I also want to point out that eating at night is also required in a lot of athletic circumstances. We've been really fortunate at the ISSM, which is the Institute of Sports Science and Medicine at Florida State, to track and work with Ultraman athletes. Ultraman is a ridiculous race that's 321.6 miles over 3 days. It starts with a 10K swim and then a 92-mile bike on a Friday. You finish late at night, and then you have to compete again starting at 6 in the morning. And then you start with a 171-mile bike ride. You finish late at night, and then you get up very early, starting at 4:45 a.m. run, where you run a double marathon on Sunday. So we went to track these people. Yeah, it's ridiculous. We don't have many endurance folks, do we? So one of the things that we picked up on right away is if they're not eating before bed, they're at a huge problem starting the next day. Underfed, undernourished, overworked, and so clearly there are circumstances where eating before sleep is a necessity. So we certainly can't blanket it that overall we have to stop eating at a certain time. All right, so the work there actually is really neat. We started looking at all types of hormone changes and things that happen in these guys. We're going back again this year to look at sleep and how sleep and immune and these types of things affect the athletes. So anyway, it is a necessity at times, but to show you the original data, this is the question, right? Isn't eating before bed bad for me? And there is some data that shows that. The thing that you need to think about, though, is most of that data is in people who are shift workers who work all through the night, or in people who have nighttime eating syndrome, where they eat a majority of their calories late in the evening. And it's a medical disorder. It's a problem. And that's where a lot of the studies came from, signifying metabolic problems coming from eating at night. This particular study I want to point out because it was not in those types of people. It was in 9 obese young men, and it just simply points out that we do have metabolic shifts in how we handle food based on time of day, our circadian changes in these things. In this particular study, they gave the same meal, which was 544 calories, just 15% protein, 35% fat, the rest being carbohydrate. They gave it at 3 different times of day, so you can see 9 a.m., 5 p.m., or 1 a.m. And it goes in order, so this is your 9 a.m. response to that meal when they gave it in the middle of the day, and then when they gave it late at night. All right, so this type of data picked up word, and it was saying, all right, well, if you eat late at night, your metabolic response to that food is diminished, and it's going to make you get fat. And so, again, that took off without people understanding what is the content of the meal, how big is the meal, what are you actually eating, and that's the next question. What are you actually eating before sleep? Clearly, I would imagine most people experience both of these scenarios where you're doing one or the other. And every time we talk about this topic, everybody wants us to invent some type of ice cream to use in these night feeding studies, which we haven't done yet. We probably should. But that's the question. What are you eating before bed? And what does the data show when you use a more manageable dose of caloric consumption? So from this point on, almost all of the data is looking at about 150 calories of a protein-dominant or solely protein meal. That's usually what we're seeing in the data from our lab and from Van Loon's lab. But even so, when I start talking about these things, people say, well, okay, it's still, okay, you're getting more protein if you're having this before sleep, but that's simply more calories. I'm still going to get fat if I eat it before going to bed. I want to point out something. Joey did a nice job pointing out how in non-dieting circumstances, a higher protein intake didn't change lean mass in this case, but it did affect fat mass. But in a dieting circumstance, this data is from morbidly obese patients that we worked at with our bariatric center in Tallahassee. And what we did was, over a period of time, we had changes over 6 and 12 weeks of measuring these folks. And keep in mind, the bariatric recommendation is if they're not going to get the surgery, is an 800-calorie diet. And it's liquid. I mean, it's primarily liquid. It's these OptiFast diets and things. That's absurdly low in any scenario. And we went in and just started working with the dietitians and physicians at the clinic and said, what can we do? Let's try some type of different standard of care. And so we simply implemented everybody to be taking a higher protein diet, which we gave them just supplemental protein powders. So they had to eat their standard care OptiFast stuff. We added in a protein. Then one group got to also resistance train, which is not part of the practice. There's really nothing about exercise that they're involved with. So these guys got to join our study. After 2 years of recruiting, we ended up with only 8 people. That shows you how many people wanted the surgery and not to get involved with the diet and exercise program. The people who did, again, this is only 8 people. Again, it took 2 years to collect that. This is after 12 weeks, so we can just look at these 2 bars. This is our control group, so they had protein, but they did not have resistance training. The group over here did resistance training and had a higher protein intake. So they both lost, this is a change in body mass, a significant amount of body mass. You're looking at down here nearly 20 kgs and here nearly 16 kgs of weight lost over 12 weeks. That's huge. But the thing to point out is this, is that after 12 weeks, the group who was doing resistance training and had the higher protein intake had only a 4% loss in muscle mass versus the other group who had nearly 25% loss in muscle mass. I mean, that's amazing. This data is in preparation. We hope to get this submitted here in the next couple of weeks. But it's fantastic. Dr. Kim and Dr. Joe worked on this, and I was helping them with it, but really neat information. So the point is, on a huge calorie deficit, higher protein seems to work, and adding resistance training also seems to work. So if you translate that to night, so the question becomes, what about if you have this protein specifically before bed? Again, we've done this in a number of groups. In our obese women who are not training in an acute type of a scenario, we've sent them home, or they had their supplement with us and they went home to sleep and came back in the morning, and we simply measured metabolism with oxygen-carbon dioxide exchange. Very simple design. When they came in the morning, it turns out that the placebo was in this particular study, was a carbohydrate, and then there was a whey protein and then a casein and a crossover design. You can tell from the data, and I put it up there, there's no statistically significant differences in our numbers, but we have to, in this field, sometimes you have to look at what's meaningful versus what's statistically different. I'm sure, Brad, you probably talked about that earlier. The difference here is that I can tell, I mean, you look at that, which which way are these things going? You see this with metabolism, the same exact figure. I'm only showing RQ, and what I want to point out is the casein group. So the casein group had this shake, obviously, before bed, and they had the smallest change in RQ, and RQ obviously is getting at our fat oxidation or what fuel source we're using, and the lower in terms of coming down towards 0.7, the better in terms of fat use. So we saw this, and it was just kind of a side note, sort of asterisk this, so this will come back in just a few minutes. But casein really wasn't affecting fat ox all that much in this group. Now, we looked at insulin in a couple of scenarios. You see on the left side, when we measured insulin in these folks in the morning, we had a problem. With no exercise, these obese women had a rise in insulin in every scenario by eating before going to bed. And so initially you thought, oh, well, maybe we should really think about the population who's taking this. Perhaps it's not great for that group. But when we followed it up with including exercise 3 days a week, and this was just a 4-week study, that went away. There was now no problem with insulin. So it just shows how powerful the exercise effect is. We can't forget how good exercise is for us, and it needs to be included in when you're thinking about these nighttime feeding scenarios. So this is still the obese women who were training with us three times per week. This is change in fat mass. Again, statistically, no differences, but if you look at the direction of change, people were getting excited about it. It's very small, but you can see in just 4 weeks, if you're taking one of the protein shakes, you tended to have a better outcome. Right, so we started to think about what that means. In the papers, we have to say, because it's what it is, there's no statistically significant differences. But we try to emphasize that look at what direction this is going, and then like Darren was talking about, more research is needed. It has to be further. We have to do this for a longer period of time to see if that pans out to anything meaningful. So we shifted from the obese population and started looking at fit young men. That's why Rob's up there. He's not in here, is he? Oh, it's too bad. So we wanted to see what would happen in a very similar scenario. We were criticized in the previous studies for using carbohydrate as our control. So we decided in these studies to add a true control that was non-caloric. And we've done that ever since, just because reviewers and trying to get these things published and a better design overall. So what we show here is in terms of calories, if you had a drink that was either carbohydrate, whey, or casein before going to sleep, you had an improvement in morning metabolism. And up until this time, we weren't doing sleepover studies, so they took it, went home and slept and came back. Clearly some things can happen in there in terms of methodology, but it was what we had as a tool at the time. And so what we showed from this was that if you're a fit young man, eating something can improve metabolism. There's the fit young man. And then if you look at the RQ again, so our fat oxidation values, that looks very similar to what we saw in the obese women. We'll highlight casein again, is that with casein, it was very similar to having nothing at all, meaning fat oxidation, we thought from this, was going to stay the same as not having anything. So there was no blunting of lipolysis. You were still having that fat oxidation response despite taking 150 calories of casein protein drink before bed. So that was exciting for us to see, but we still were missing a big chunk of data. We didn't know what was happening while they were asleep. So that led us to start using a technique called microdialysis, where we insert small probes into the subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue, and we can measure glycerol as an indicator of lipolysis all night long. And so that's what we'll do. We put these probes into, now we're using different populations. The most exciting one's a young fit women study that's starting up just here in a few weeks. But this was obese folks, again, obese men. And what we saw, we wanted to show what was happening with the casein in terms of RQ. We started showing an actual data from belly fat, which was no difference between having a casein drink or having a placebo, which was no calories. So again, it's kind of funny. Joey described it earlier. You're designing studies that essentially show nothing, but you're happy about that? Well, we are. Like, we're designing these things, and in this particular case, there's no difference between the groups, but that's really what was intended to be seen. We see that the casein drink did not blunt, they didn't stop that overnight fat mobilization. All right, so that was exciting for us. Now, shifting gears slightly to Luke's work, Luke Van Loon, if you don't follow his work, definitely do it. It's some great stuff. He's from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and Luke put together some fantastic data over the last 6, 7 years as well. We sort of going back and forth with trying to get these out, and he's crushed me this year in how many pubs he's gotten. So I need to work on it. But this is his original data. This is Rez and one of his other students, Groen, put this out. They look at young and old men, and they do a really neat technique where they inject a Holstein cow with radio-labeled isotopes. They get the milk from the cow, and the people drink the milk. So you actually are drinking the radioisotopes instead of injecting them. So it's just a neat technique that they use. The bottom line here is that if you're a younger or an older man in their original work, overnight you're having an increase in muscle protein synthesis. But as Darren spoke about, that's just starting your car. It doesn't mean you get to where you're trying to go. And so we started thinking about, well, let's see if that results in hypertrophy or strength or any kind of size gains over time. Just recently, Luke put out 2 new studies. This is just a snapshot of the data. Reiterates what you just saw. In the previous slide, they had no exercise was involved. In this particular case, they purposefully resistance trained at night and then fed and then went to sleep, and they took biopsies pre and post and blood samples all night. He swears they don't wake up doing all this, but I don't know about it. But so in this case, again, training at night and then taking a protein drink, a casein drink pre-sleep has a great response. We've seen it in daytime studies of training and amino acid intake. So just kind of showing that it does work all the way through the night as well. What I thought was interesting was this study that Dirks put out last year. Again, it's Van Loon's group. And this is older individuals, and they were sedentary older individuals. They were just using the neuromuscular stim unit. And so they do these neat studies where they stim one leg and the other leg's the control, and then they take biopsies out of both legs and all this. So they were doing this. They fed them a casein drink before sleep. I think this one, this was 40 grams, so their dosing went from 30. Now they're giving 40 grams boluses in their studies. So in an injured scenario, if anyone works with athletes, you can still have a response by using stim and giving a pre-sleep protein drink, in this case, where you had an 18% greater response by having even just neuromuscular stim, which I thought was a pretty neat inclusion here. Now for athletes, the question is, does this work over time, and does it change my performance? And honestly, there's not a lot of data here. We're working on this extensively to try to figure out more from this. This was probably the most popular one from the last 2 years, was Snyder's, who again, Van Loon's group. They finally did this over 12 weeks. They resistance trained. Every night they had their protein drink or not, depending on the groups that they were in. And you can see that it got all over the media. It was showing that they had increases in quad size and increases in cross-sectional area. So from a hypertrophy standpoint, the MPS that they saw acute translated over time into these results. But you need to note a couple of things here. The drink they took before bed was 27.5 grams of protein, but it also had 15 grams of carbohydrate. Up until this point, carbohydrate wasn't given in a mix. It was just protein. So what influence does that have? I mean, it seemed to do something here. And the other thing is the groups ended up having a difference in total protein intake in the day. All right, so this study was highly criticized for that because it was the protein was different between the groups, so of course they saw an increase and the other group didn't. Luke and his crew, and us too, to a large extent, argue that, well, the design is to simply look at what's happening before bed, and can we use that as a window to perhaps conveniently take extra protein shake and have something happen overnight, and that's sort of been the case. But now we're starting to realize, okay, we need to design studies that are protein matched to see is it that it's right before bed, or is it that it's actually just more protein in the whole day. And that it may be the case, but still a convenient time to take it might be pre-sleep. It's an easy time to remember. It's, you can shake it up, have it right in your fridge ready to go. Very simple to do that. We looked at one performance study in elite female runners a couple of years ago. Just got the data out last year. This particular one, we were using chocolate milk, not a powdered protein shake. So we saw nothing. I mean, they had more carbohydrate oxidation in the morning, so they had metabolic changes, but they didn't have any performance changes. So nothing was really going on there. This only had 12 grams of protein in it, though. In the chocolate milk that we gave, 355 mils, it was only 12 grams of protein. So we often wonder, this is acute as well, if we did it over time, what about recovery? maintaining speed over duration of a season, all things we have not done yet. But in terms of endurance, performance, and their 10K run times, no difference in elite female runners. Again, the consideration has to be given, protein has not been matched to date. So the studies that we're beginning now in resistance-trained women, full-day microdialysis, sleeping in the lab, I mean, we've ramped up everything. And now we're going to try to figure that out, and the protein will be matched between the groups in the study that we're starting here in just a few weeks. So we're excited about that. And we're also getting into whole food options. So we're going to look at proteins versus, the first one will be cottage cheese, to see if you have the same response. And we just don't know. So we're going to see that so we can, whenever I'm interviewed from media, they say, well, what foods can it be? Well, it's a powder. We don't know what foods it can be. So this time we'll find out. So here's your wrap up for this. For endurance athletes, for what we know, no change in performance, no change in hydration status. They did have increased carbohydrate oxidation in the morning, which may be good for a short race, maybe. They did also have increased metabolic rate, which matched our trained men and matched our obese women as well. One thing we didn't have time to talk about yet, but maybe we can do it in the panel, is the concept of train high, sleep low. That has nothing to do with altitude. That has everything to do with carbohydrate availability. So we can talk about that. Louise Burke's group from Australia has been heavily pushing that. And there's some really interesting findings that have to do with it. But I will note, if you look at that data, if anyone's familiar with the train high, sleep low concept, everybody forgets they also had a protein shake before bed. And it's right there in the data, but no one talks about it. Every single time they did carbohydrate depletion, but they still had a protein shake before going to sleep. Just interesting to note. And the strength and power, what we know so far, this is essentially from Luke's data, increased muscle protein synthesis, increased lean mass and strength, but again, protein wasn't matched. So that seems like a convenient time to take it. If you just say do it, it seems to work, but clearly the protein differences matter. And then we've shown better subjective recovery in some data we're trying to do with damaging them with a hard workout and then feeding at night. We need to fine tune that, but so far that's N of 7, I think, from the data, just feeling better recovered from having the nighttime drinks. Again, no GI distress. That's important for athletes as well. And if you're not an athlete, the other folks might think about large mixed meals, perhaps not the best choice. We've seen that data from the 1993 work and on. And then small protein-rich meals is where we're going. Again, it's 30 to 40 grams is what we're giving, and that's the spread of the data. It's like 150-ish calories. Seeing increases in morning resting metabolic rate, decreases in hunger in the morning. Again, we're trying to interpret that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing if you're not eating in the morning? Or are you eating anyway, you're just telling me you're not hungry? So we have not yet put out like a full buffet spread and actually seeing if they eat more food. So that's on the horizon for us. And then no change in fat oxidation, which is really exciting. So what you can say is that it's obese. In this case, we've done obese men, and we're working on the other groups. From a breath standpoint or from a microdialysis standpoint, you don't change fat oxidation. So eating at night doesn't stop you, and when I say eating, 150 calories, protein shake, does not stop your lipolysis overnight or your fat oxidation. So it's not hurting you in any way, and it probably is helpful. And bottom line, protein before sleep may help, but it won't hurt you. All right, thank you.
We can do one, possibly two quick questions as we do the swap over. Alex, can you help us with the microphone swap?
Hello. Thank you. Great talk, Sarah.
Hi.
Question regarding your bariatric data. With the supplemental protein, did you add that to the 800 or just increase the ratio of protein within the 800 kcals?
We added it, so they ended up with like 1,200 calories across the journey, which was great. I mean, they were so hungry. Oh, one other note that I think is important to hear is that most people think that Americans, particularly obese Americans, eat too much protein or eat enough protein, and it's just not the case, particularly when you do it grams per kg. We looked at those folks, and their grams per kg was like 0.2 to 0.3 because they were so big. So they might have eaten like the normal amount of protein that you or I have, but their body mass is so high, their grams per kg are so low. So clearly on the low side. Yeah, still low. Yeah, because now they're not as strong as we thought. They're also sarcopenic and obese. It's unbelievable.
All right, so we're going to transition on.